Welcome back to the next part of this React query tutorial. This time we'll talk about optimistic updates. Let's have a quick reminder of where we left off. Right now the checkbox and delete buttons are functional, but as we see here, there's latency. There's a bit of delay for the mutation to be applied in the UI. And this is because we're waiting for a response from the REST API. In a real-world application, it's normal to have some latency. However, for something like a checkbox, when a user expects instant UI feedback, having latency might not be a great user experience. To solve this problem, we can use what's called optimistic updates. In essence, this means reflecting the change immediately in the UI before we get a response from the backend. This approach is called optimistic because it assumes that the mutation will ultimately be successful. However, we do need to implement logic to perform a rollback if an error occurs, as well as display an error message. There is quite a few steps that we'll need to follow, and they will be a bit more complex from the code we've written so far. But don't worry, you can follow along, and if you ever get stuck, you can refer to the links I've added in the description of the video. Let's start with the optimistic version of the update mutation. So I'll create a new file. And in this file, we can copy-paste everything we had from the useUpdateTodoMutation. In our case, we can rename it to useUpdateTodoMutation optimistic. We'll still be using the same mutation function, in particular todo's API.update, but we can replace this onSuccess callback. Instead, we'll need an onMutate callback. And this will be an async function which takes an updated todo as an argument. And remember, this updated todo is coming from todo's API.update. Now inside this onMutate callback, the very first thing we can do is to cancel any outgoing refetches. So this is important in order to not overwrite our optimistic update. So we can write await query client dot cancel queries, and we'll pass in a query key of todos. The next step we'll need to do is snapshot the previous value, and this is important so that we can optimistically calculate the new value, but having the previous todos is also important in case there's an error and we need to roll back to this value. In this case, it'll be queryClient.getQueryData. And remember, the type is TodoList model. Again, we'll pass in the query key of todos. Now that we have the previous todos, we can calculate the new values. So first I'll just check if it's defined, just to make sure. And then we can calculate new todos. And I'll do this using the map function. So previous todos.map. In particular, we'll check if item.id matches the updated todo.id. And if so, we'll return the updated todo. Otherwise, we'll return the item. So what this piece of logic does over here is that it'll look for the ID that matches the updated todo and set it to that value. In particular, it'll set that entire todo item, and it'll leave the other items as is. So once we've computed this new list, we can apply the optimistic update by doing queryClient.setQueryData. We'll pass in the key of todos, and then the argument new to-dos. So just to recap, we calculated the new to-dos, and then we do set query data to apply that value. The last thing we'll need to do in this onMutate callback is to return the previous to-dos in case there's an error. Now we can move on to the onError callback. As arguments, this takes an error, variables, and context. So here we can have the rollback logic. We can just check if context.previousToDos is defined, and if so, we can perform a rollback if there's an error. So we can write query client dot set query data, and we'll set it to context.previousToDos. Just a reminder that this context.previoToDos is the one that's being returned from the onMutate. And the very last thing we can do in this mutation is pass an onSettled. And we can write query client dot invalidate queries. And the query key will be to-dos. So this onSettled, what it will do is, if we have a success or if we have an error, in both cases we'll always refetch, just to make sure we're reflecting the true state of the server. And now we can repeat this process for the optimistic version of the delete mutation. So let's create a new hook. And we can actually copy paste everything we just wrote from the useUpdateTodoMutation optimistic. We'll need to modify a few things, of course, but the overall structure will be very similar. So for the name of the hook, we can call this useDeleteTodoMutation. And for the parameters, the mutation function won't be calling TodosAPI.update. Instead, it'll be TodosAPI.delete. And for the onMutate callback, the argument won't be an updated to-do, it'll be an ID, and this will be of type string. Remember that this comes from the TodosAPI.delete. And the last thing we'll need to modify here is how we calculate the new to-dos. So I'll get rid of this. Instead, what we'll use here is previous to-dos dot filter. Since we're doing a delete, we'll keep all the ones where the item.id is not equal to the ID that we defined at the top. And now all we need to do is call these new optimistic mutations from the React component. So let's navigate to the components inside the to-do list. And at the top of the file, we can replace the useUpdateTodoMutation with useUpdateTodoMutation optimistic. And same thing for the delete. We can replace it with useDeleteTodoMutation, but this time the optimistic version. Let's test that the optimistic update works as expected. So if we click on the checkbox, we'll see that there's no latency like before. The change gets applied immediately in the UI. And same thing for the delete. If I click on the X, it's removed right away in the UI. So this is a great improvement in terms of user experience. And to confirm, if you open the network tab in the browser, you can see that doing the change in the UI actually happens before the API request is complete. So this is what we expected. We can even check one more thing. I'll block the request URL to see what would happen if there was an error. And we can see that there's an error message in the bottom right. This is the toast that we added in the onError callback. So this is a great user experience. So if you made it up to now, congratulations, we've built a fully functioning to-do app using React Query. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.